All right, everybody, welcome back. We are going to be starting this week with Module 3. And this week we're going to be covering kind of a broad spectrum of ecological principles, but we're going to be zooming out even farther than we did in our first week, where we covered population ecology and community ecology. So now we're going to be zooming out to ecosystem ecology. And essentially what that is, it's understanding larger networks of populations and communities. And critically, we're going to be examining some of the factors that are most important for ecosystem ecology, such as climate change, population increases, water scarcity. So we're going to be going through a lot of these ideas when we're thinking about ecosystem ecology. So I wanted to give us an example of ecosystem ecology. And this is looking at Professor Zhang's work, looking at beetle size and climate change and warming temperatures. So you can see here that each of these dots is a species of beetle. And we can see as temperature has increased in degrees centigrade, the overall pattern of all these different species is a decrease in body size mass. And indeed, she even goes even further to classify that larger beetles tend to shrink even more than smaller beetles. But overall, this is again linking this idea of multiple communities, multiple species, and understanding how those species are responding to this global phenomenon, which is warming temperatures. So throughout this week, some of these driving questions that we're going to be looking at are, first off, what exactly are ecosystems? And then how are ecosystems being affected by these larger dynamics, such as climate change? Secondly, we're going to talk about the greenhouse effect and what does that have to do with global warming. So a lot of this lecture is going to be understanding specific definitions of these global processes. You've probably all been exposed to these types of processes before, but what we're really wanting to drive down on is understanding the specific ecology that biologists use to describe these effects. Thirdly, we're going to talk about carbon cycle as well as other chemicals that cycle through these ecosystems. And lastly, just as a sort of a technical note, sort of understanding how scientists are able to compare present day's levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide to past levels, and why we want to actually understand what was happening in the past compared to what's happening currently. So first off, we really want to understand exactly what is an ecosystem. And ultimately, an ecosystem is a dynamic system that is talking much more about complex interacting components that include both our biotic and abiotic counterparts. So we're not just talking about living organisms in this case. We're actually thinking about living organisms, non-living parts of an ecosystem, and how they interact with one another. Now, an ecosystem shouldn't be confused with a biome, which is probably another term that I'm sure you've come across before. Ultimately, a biome is just understanding a geographic region that is notable for specific species that are living there. And for example, a biome can contain multiple ecosystems. So for example, an aquatic biome can contain coral reef ecosystems, or can contain kelp forest ecosystems. So it's, again, just describing geographically areas that have similar properties that contain specific species. So now that we understand what a biome is and what an ecosystem is, we're going to shift to understanding the dynamics that really affect biomes and ecosystems. And that first process that we're going to talk about is the greenhouse effect. Again, you've likely come across all of these terms before, but we're going to be very careful about the specific terminology that we use because how a biologist explains these effects can vary. So we want to be very specific in how we engage with this terminology. So the greenhouse effect is essentially trapping heat in Earth's atmosphere. So as heat is radiated back out to the atmosphere, greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, absorb this radiated heat. So when we're thinking about the greenhouse effect, we want to start thinking about, okay, so we understand that the greenhouse effect is a natural process. However, there are things can impact or enhance these natural processes. And that's where we start to get into understanding CO2 concentrations. So increases in greenhouse gases enhance the greenhouse effect. And that ultimately leads to global warming because, again, we have more heat trapped in the atmosphere. And that heat that's trapped in the atmosphere is ultimately what is causing global warming. And global warming, all we're talking about is an increase in the Earth's temperature, nothing more. And I'm sure that you've come across these graphs before where we're looking at historic temperatures that we are able to derive from tree rings, corals, ice cores, as well as historical records. And now when we start to look at the warming that is happening recently, we see what we call this hockey stick graphs, where we see a dramatic increase in temperatures, and the last decade has been the hottest decade on record. So that moves us on to climate change. So we know, again, that global warming is just the recent continuing increase in the average global temperature, whereas climate change is any substantial change in the climate that lasts for an extended period. And this is how scientists talk about these specific features. So now that we're talking about climate change, which has happened in the past and changes, we're really talking about this extended period of time. And that's when we start thinking about what's happening currently. We know that humans are what is ultimately causing the most substantial change in our climate. And we're going to talk more specifically about that in later lectures. So again, in summary, this is just sort of a vocabulary dump of understanding specific definitions of major processes that influence ecosystem ecology. So again, ecosystems are made up of living, non-living components of the environment. Biomes, again, are large geographically distinct ecosystems defined by their characteristic plant life. Climate change is the persistent pattern of change in Earth's climate, whereas global warming is just an increase in the Earth's average temperature over time. And lastly, the greenhouse effect is this natural process by which heat is radiated from the Earth's surface and is absorbed by heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. All right, so we'll pick up in Module 3.2. See you soon.